Hello, I'm Nancy Strickland from IT Mentors. This video on MVC, the Model View Controller Pattern, is part of a series on the Beta 2 release of Visual Studio 2010 and the .NET Framework 4. This video will explain what ASP.NET MVC is and demonstrate how to use it, and explain some of the advantages that it has as an approach. ASP.NET isn't a single technology. It's a bunch of tools and technologies, things to handle both the presentation and the runtime for applications. It's everything you need in one package. But since .NET 3.5 SP1, ASP.NET has become more modular. ASP.NET Core is the runtime aspect of ASP.NET, and it can operate independently of any particular presentation technology. So ASP.NET isn't an all-or-nothing technology, and that means that ASP.NET Web Forms, which is the traditional way of writing a user interface, is just one presentation option that can sit on top of the runtime. In other words, you can use other presentation layer implementations instead of Web Forms, and that's where the new ASP.NET MVC framework comes in. So ASP.NET MVC isn't a replacement for Web Forms. It's just another option for developing your web applications using the ASP.NET runtime. So why might you consider something other than Web Forms? It's been around for a long time, and it's a nice, intuitive way to develop a user interface. It's like WinForms. But it does have some weaknesses, and the first is structural. WinForms does make your life easier in terms of just quickly getting your user interface up and attached to some logic. But when applications get larger, then it can get complicated keeping up with all the various elements. You've got master pages, and you've got detail pages, and you've got user controls and server controls and customer controls, and you have HTML and data access control and business logic. And often these things are mixed on the same page in the same file. There's no clear delineation between the responsibilities. And that's why frameworks have become popular. Frameworks, and that's what MVC is, as we'll see in a minute, frameworks give you guidance about the overall structure of your application, what should be doing what and when, and what should be speaking to what. Now, of course, you can apply, and you should, apply best practices and provide good separation of function and make a well-organized Web Forms application. But the point is that you have to do that on your own, because Web Forms, by itself, doesn't impose any discipline or provide any support for that. And another area to consider when deciding what technology to use with ASP.NET is testing. Now, of course, you can, and again, you should, test your Web Forms application. But again, Web Forms itself doesn't provide any particular special support for that to make it easier, and it doesn't provide any guidance on how to test or what to test or when. In fact, the tight linking and the dependencies, the coupling between various elements and layers of Web Forms applications can make it harder to test, because it's hard to isolate the part that you want to test and test just it cleanly. A good framework can give you guidance on what to test and when and how, and it should also make it easier to write those tests. And that brings us to MVC. It's an alternative to Web Forms that can help you with some of those problems we just described. ASP.NET MVC is Microsoft's implementation of the more general MVC, Model View Controller Pattern. So we're going to start by looking at that. And of course, as of the Beta 2, it comes built in to Visual Studio 2010. MVC, Model View Controller, is a design pattern, an architectural design pattern that divides up the responsibilities of an application and assigns roles to three components to give you a cleaner separation and more control for your design, for your development, for testing, and for maintenance. The three parts are obviously what gives MVC its name: the model, the view, and the controller. I'll start with the controller, which is responsible for handling all the user input. It receives the input, and then it performs operations based on that. Then the model represents the core logic of the application. It handles the data that represents the application domain, and the controller can retrieve data through the model. Then the view is the visual representation of the model. It presents the model data to the user in whatever way is appropriate. So in a web application, that would typically be HTML. Dividing up the responsibilities like this between these three elements provides clear limits between the presentation layer and the other parts of your application, and so it makes it easier to test each part individually. So how do those parts interact? When an HTTP request comes into the application, it's mapped to a particular controller for that request. In a web application, that input is usually in the form of an HTTP request. And then the controller has code that acts on the input. Often what it does is to get data from the model and use it to create a presentation model, some sort of subset of the data based on the user's request. And then that model data is sent to the view, which is responsible for formatting the model data and presenting it back to the viewer. And again, in a web application, this would typically be in HTML. In this demo, we're going to look at the basic structure of a simple little ASP.NET MVC application. I've already opened Visual Studio 2010, the Beta 2 version, so you see the new Start page here. And I'll select File, New Project. This is a C# project, and under the Web Templates here, I'm going to select ASP.NET MVC 2. That's for version 2. That's the newest version, and as you can see, it comes built right into Visual Studio. I'm going to leave the default name here and put it right on the desktop. Now I get a dialog here that lets me create a unit tests project if I want to. If I choose to do that, if I say yes here, then another project will be created in the same solution for my testing. This is obviously one way that MVC supports and encourages you to do your testing. But I'm not going to create those unit tests right now. We'll get back to that later. Okay, so my project is created, and over here in the Solution Explorer, you can see that there's folders for controllers and models and views, so you can see that they're part of the basic structure. And now watch this. I haven't written a single line of code, but I can run this project right now. I'm going to run it by clicking this Run button over here, up here, which will be the debugging button, so you can see the message I'm going to get. Debugging is disabled by default because you wouldn't want debugging messages in your production code. They could be sent to the user. So I have two choices. I can enable the debugging in web.config. The app will do it for me automatically if I choose this option, and then I just have to remember to disable it again before the app goes into production. Or I can just run it without debugging, which is what I'm going to do now. So my starter app's going to start running here in a sec. There it is. This is my home page with a little welcome message, welcome to ASP.NET MVC, and some other content here, which I could customize. We'll see that in a minute. And it's already got some basic functionality, like this About button here takes you to an About page that you can also customize by adding some content here. It's also got a logon link here that's functional. It takes you to a logon page, but the code here isn't functional yet. You have to add the logic, but it does have some basic validation. So if I try to log on now without having put anything in here, you can see that it's done some basic validation for me. Okay, I'm going to close that and look at the pieces of this app in code. I'm going to start by opening the controllers folder here, and you can see there's two controllers. I'm going to look at the home controller. It's a special controller because it's the default one that starts up when the app starts. So I'm going to double click it and get to the C code here. There's two methods in it, index and about. Let's look at index. The type it's returning here is an action result. That's the standard return type for all methods of a controller. It's an abstract type that encapsulates the result of the method. The actual return type is, of course, a child class of this abstract parent action result. In this case, what's being returned is a view result, which is the most common result type. It uses an appropriate view to render the model, the page we want to send, back to the user. There's also other result types. It could have been a redirect result that sends the user somewhere else, or a file content result to download a file, or a JavaScript result, or several other things. Now in the body here, it's setting the message property of a view data dictionary, and you probably remember that this is what it said on that home page that we came to. We'll see how it got there in a minute. And then it returns, it shows a view, and that's what it returns. But I said that the return value was an action result type. Well, normally you don't return an action result directly. Instead, you call a method from the controller base class. It can be a view method or a redirect method or a file method, etc. And that returns the kind of result you want. Now, the index method returns a view named index to the browser. It's a view named index even though it doesn't show it here. And that's because normally you can infer the name of the view from the name of the method. But if you want, you can make the name of the view the argument to the view method here. So I could type in index here to be more explicit and clearer, although I don't have to. Now, to see what that view looks like, I'm going to go back over here to the Solution Explorer, and I'll go down here to Views and expand it. And in the Home folder, there's the index file, index.aspx. I'm going to open it, and you can see here is that dictionary, that view data dictionary. So that's where that message, that welcome to ASP.NET MVC, is going to be on the page, the one we saw on the home page when we ran the app. Now I could edit this page, I could customize it right now by changing code here in the view, or by changing what's being sent by that index method in the home controller. I'll just make a little change right now. And then I'll run it again. I'm going to use Control F5 so I don't have any problems with the debugger. And you can just see what it looks like. There we go. There's my new wording. Now, I said that the home controller starts first, but I didn't tell you why. It's because of another important feature of MVC, ASP.NET routing, which maps the incoming browser requests to a particular MVC controller and method. There are some default routing rules that are built in, but the system is flexible, and you can modify those, or you can define your own URL mapping rules so that a particular URL of your choice gets directed wherever you want. Let me show you how that's done. I'm going to go to the global ASPX file here and open it. And here is the only route really that has been set up so far. It says that the default URL for this app, when it comes in, is to be mapped to a controller action ID, and the controller should be home, and the action, that's the method, right, should be index, and then there is no particular ID here. IDs, that's a parameter that can be passed in. Now, I could change this so that some other action would be the first called. That's not what you'd normally do, but just to show you, I'm going to map it to the about method. Now, if we click back over here on our home controller, you can see that the about method also returns a view, and again, by default, it's going to return the about view. And the about view is the one that we saw earlier, but I'll show it to you again. It's the one that says put content here. So I'll put a little content there. And now I'll run it again. That's Control F5 to avoid the debugger issue. And you'll see that the About page is the first one called, and that it now says created for MS-DEV. And there it is. So as I add more pages to my application, I can move between them with hyperlinks, or I can set up a mapping here to some URL and handle it that way instead. And now let's look back one more time into the views here. You can see there's subfolders that organize the view pages that are available. So Home has got a couple of pages, and Account has got some pages. And under Shared, I have some pages, some views that could be shared among several other pages, like the error page, for example. There's also a logon control there, and there's a master page for the site that you can use as a template. So we've seen controllers and views and routing, but you can see that there's nothing in the model folder yet. We'll see that in the next demo in just a few minutes. Some of the advantages of ASP.NET MVC are that it provides you with conventions and guidance. There's a set of predefined conventions that make it easier to use without a lot of configuration that you have to determine and you have to do. It's a framework, a pattern that guides you while you're creating your application towards a design that's more likely to be clean and easy to test and easy to maintain and a long-term success. Then it also gives you tight control over your markup, because ASP.NET MVC doesn't have the kind of high-level controls that, while they're easy to use, also hide how they work under the surface. ASP.NET MVC gives you complete control over your markup. MVC is also test-friendly. As we're going to see a little later, the MVC framework is specifically designed to make it easy for developers to do the kind of testing that they know they should be doing. And then finally, it's ASP.NET, so it leverages the benefits that are already in ASP.NET. It's built on top of the core ASP.NET runtime, so you're going to have a lot of the same elements that you're already familiar with. There's not so much that you have to learn new to get started using ASP.NET MVC. Of course, you can use ASP.NET MVC right out of the box. That's what we're going to look at in just a minute in the next demo. But you can also customize it. You can easily replace anything in the execution pipeline with your own implementation. ASP.NET MVC is all about separation of concerns. So throughout its entire API, every task has specific representation that can easily be replaced without affecting anything else around it. We're going to write a little database application that lets a user list records or insert new records. So, File, New Project, Visual C#, it's a web project, ASP.NET MVC 2. I'm going to leave the default name and put it right on the desktop. I'm not going to create a test project this time, but I will write some tests in the next demo. To start here, I'm going to go to Controllers, and I'm going to get rid of the Home controller. I'm going to write my own. And that means down in Views that I'll also get rid of the whole Home folder. I'm going to start by getting a database to work with. I'm going to right-click here on the App Data folder and say Add, Existing Item, and I'm going to browse to a very tiny little database that I wrote just for this application. There it is. I want you to see what's in it. It's very simple, so I'm going to double-click it here in Solution Explorer so that it will open up over here in Server Explorer. And I'll open Tables. You can see there's only one table, User. Let me double click it, and you can see that it has only two columns, one for an ID and one for a username. Now I'm going to create a data model class for this user table that has gets and sets for the properties, the columns, the fields. And that's something I could, do by hand, but I can do it very quickly and easily with the Entity Framework. Now the Entity Framework is covered in detail in another video in this series, the videos on ADO.NET, but it's part of this same series on Visual Studio 2010, so you can find it on MSDev, where you found this one. Okay, it's covered in detail in that video, so I'm just going to show you how to use it for this one little thing here and not really talk about it. I'm going to right-click on my model folder here, and I'm going to say Add to my models, a new item, it's a data item, so I'll go up here and select the data templates, and I'm going to select an ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'm just going to leave it with this default name Model 1 EDMX, but you might normally name it something else. Now a wizard's going to open, and I'm going to select Generate from Database, and that will create some classes in code based on the tables, or the entities rather, in my database. I'm going to go through the wizard here. It's already pointing to the one I want, database MDF, because it's right here in my project already. But I could make a connection to somewhere else if that was what I needed. Let me go back for 1 second and show you that in the code it's going to be saved as database 1 entities. Alright, let me go on. Now I need to select what I want, and under tables I want the one and only table, the user table. And I'm done now. I'm going to click Finish. Now it's generating my model, and in a minute you'll see it come up. There we go. So I have a nice little graphic of my model. Remember that the model in MVC is the data, the representation of entities in the domain. And there's a C# class that matches this, so that should make it clearer why I chose to name the table user, because eventually it generates a class in code that represents that entity. In fact, let me go to my model, and there's my C# class. I'll open it up, and you can see that here under Entities, there's my class called User, and it has properties in it for the name and the ID. There's my ID, and there's my name. So those were automatically generated. And that means that my code can get and set those properties when it needs to. Okay, now I have my model. Now I need a controller. Let me close a few things here. I'm going to right-click on Controllers and select Add, and you see it gives me the option of just creating a controller. Obviously, that's what I want to do. I'm going to name it Home Controller. Remember, that's the one that's automatically, by default, invoked by the application when it starts. So that's why I deleted the existing one. And I'm going to check this box that says to add action methods for some of the basic operations, the create, update, and delete actions. And you'll see how handy that is in just a minute. Okay, so the home controller opens up now, and you'll see that I have stubs for index and details and create, and a couple of other things we'll look at in a few minutes. And each of them ends with returning a view of some sort. Okay, now I'm going to add the using for the models. That's using, and then the app name, which in this case is application 2, and then models. Now I need to instantiate what's called a context, which in the entity framework gives me the methods that I need to talk to my database. So I'm going to come here, and inside my class, remember I said it was called Database Entities 1? Database 1 Entities. I'll name it int, and I'll instantiate. It's a new Database 1 Entities. That's what's called a context object. Now I'm going down here to my index method, and I'm going to add in it some code to view the data, all of the data. So what I'm going to do, in return view, I'll take that context object, which knows how to do things with the model, and I'll say get me all the users. There it is. That's a collection of all the user records. And I'll convert it to a list so that the view, this is going to be the index view of course, can display it. Now I need a view to display that. So before I do that, let me just build what I've got so far here. It succeeded. So now I'm going to go over here to the view, and I can put this in whatever seems like the right folder. I could put it in shared, or I could create a new folder and call it home and put it there. And now I can right click on my new home folder and say add, and I'm going to choose to add a view. Now the kind of view I want, I'm going to name it index so that its name will match the name of my method that I'm calling in my controller. And the kind I want is a strongly typed view. In other words, I want that view to look at that class and type it accordingly. So I'll right click here, and now it can see all these views. And that, by the way, is one reason that I built the project before I got to this point, because if you don't always see the views here, because that information hasn't yet been shared. Okay, and I'm going to base this on the user table, or the user data class, I should say. And the content that I'm going to want, not an empty view, but one that takes a list, because a list is what I'm sending it. So I'm sending it a list, and here I'm telling this view page that's going to be automatically generated that the contents is a list, and that it should format for a list based on the user data class. And now I'm ready. I'll click add. And this is really great. It's auto-generated the HTML for me for the view to show all the properties of my nice little table here. Not much in it, but if it were more complex, it would show all of that. So just to show you what I've got so far, I'm going to run it now. Now again, debugging is disabled by default, so I'll run it with Control F5. And now you can see my very tiny little database. It's only got 3 records here, but it's a pretty little app, already nicely formatted with the default template here. It's got edit and details capabilities, and it's actually quick and easy and good separation of responsibilities. And now watch this. I'm going to close this. And I'm going to go here to my method. Let me close this too. To my method create. I'll go down to my create method. I'll right click here, and it gives me an option to add a view for the create method, which of course it knows is going to be called create. So when I click on it, some of the things are filled in for me. It already knows to call it create. It already knows that I want a strongly typed view, or guesses that I do, based on that same data class that this controller is already working with. The view contents, if I left them empty, that would be because I wanted to write the HTML myself, which I could, but I'm going to have the contents be the create contents, the thing that we would use to create a new record, and it will make a pretty little page with boxes for each column to fill in the data for a new record. And then down here, I forgot to show you last time, but I can select a particular master page. Remember that earlier we saw that under shared there's a site master, and that's sort of the master template for all the pages, which typically is what I'd want to use. So I'll say go ahead and add it for me. It will create that page. I can look at it, see what it's set up. You can see there's already some validation, change anything I want to, or accept it as is. Now, there is one more thing I need to do. I'm going to go back to the home controller. Now, that create view created the view that allows me to create a new record, but there's another create here, and this second kind of create takes the class as a parameter, because the first one we did gives you a view. The second one persists that new record. So what I'm going to do here is pass in a user, presumably the one I just created. And then down here, the insertion logic I'm going to get from that handy little entity framework context, int, and it has a method called add to users, and I'm going to add whatever got passed in to the users, and then I just need to save the changes, and that's what persists it. And notice here that at the end it will redirect me to the index view. And index had to be written in here to this method as an argument because the name of the method itself is not index. Okay, so I'm ready to run it. Again, Control F5. And I've got my create new link down here, which should be active now. I'll click it. It gives me a chance to put in a new ID and a new person, Carol. And when I click create, and it takes me right back to the index where I can see my new record. Okay, we said that one of the nice things about MVC is how easy it makes it to write tests and to incorporate testing into your work, or even to use a TDD, test-driven development approach, where you write your tests even before you write the code. Now let me show you how that works. I'll start another new project. Again, we're going to do a Visual C# and an MVC2. But this time, I'm going to let it add the tests for me. And when it loads, you'll be able to see over here in the Solution Explorer that I have two complete projects. Here at the top, I have my application, and then here I have the tests that match it. Now, some of the common tests you'll want to do are testing whether a controller action returns a particular view, returns a particular set of data, or returns a different type of action result than what you thought it was going to. So first, let me add a new controller to work with. I'll right-click on Controllers, select Add, Controller, and I'm going to call it the Item Controller. And I'm going to let Visual Studio add all the stub methods for me. Now I've got my controller. I want to test it, so I'm going to go down to the testing project here at the bottom, and I'll open up Controllers. I'll right-click it and say Add, and of course what I want to add is a new test. And here I'm going to select Unit Test and name it Item Controller Test. And here's my test code that I need to fill in. Now, one thing that's very handy is that MVC projects open up with a default project, because you can look at those files for examples of how to do your own code. So what I'm going to do is go to my test project and open up the home controller test, so that I can see what I need to have in my item controller, and also just do some simple cutting and pasting. Now, first of all, the usings that I need are these last four here. Well, actually it's 3 of the last 4. But I'm going to copy them all, move over to my item controller test, and paste them in. And you'll see that I got a duplicate on one of them. I'll just delete that. I knew I was going to, but I thought that was easier. Okay, now I'm going to look at the to-dos here in my generated code. In other words, I'm going to let MVC help me some more by telling me what I need to do. First one says to add constructor logic, but I don't really need any here for constructing this test class. What I'm interested in are these methods down here that have the attribute test method on them, because those are the ones that are going to be run, that are going to be called when I run my suite of tests. Okay, so going back to my model here, here's test method 1. Going back to my model that I'm using, the home controller test, I can see that it has tests for 2 methods, index and about. And you can see that in each of them, the first thing it does is to instantiate the controller and then call the method that it's trying to test, storing the result in a view result type variable. And then it asserts that something should be true something should be true if the method call does what it's supposed to do. So in the first one here, what it's going to do is look at that result at its view data dictionary, and then taking the message property out of that view data dictionary, sees if it's the correct one. And so that sort of is one way to check that the right thing got instantiated. And then if I look down here in About, you can see it does the same thing. Instantiates the controller, calls the method we're trying to test, this method right here, and then does an assertion. And in this case, it's just checking to make sure that some result was generated. So those are two common ways of testing. What I'm going to do is copy and paste, and then make the edits that I need to. So I'll just copy this one. Go over here to Item Controller Test and put them inside Test Method 1. Now obviously I need to make some changes. First of all, I don't want to instantiate the home controller. It's the item controller. That's the one I want. So I'm instantiating the controller I want to test, and then I'm going to call one of its methods. And in this case, I'll just call the index method. And the assertion, I'm going to make sure that, I'm not going to look at the data here, I'm going to see if the correct view was what was instantiated. So I'm going to say index. Is that the view name of the result? If it is, I know that the right view was what was returned. Now normally I'd also be renaming this test method to something else like test index view, something more meaningful. I'm ready to run it. I won't run it this way because I don't want to run the app. I want to run the tests. Now my test menu is over here for some reason. It can be in different places, but here's my toolbar for my testing, and it says run all the tests in the solution. That's what I'm going to do. Down here I've got a test results window. If you don't see your test results window, by the way, you can go to Test and Windows and select Test Results to make sure that you have that showing. Okay, it looks like it ran 28 methods and one of them didn't pass. Let's see which one that was. It's exactly the one I'm testing, test method 1. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that in my item controller, I just left the default behavior. And what happened here is when it returned the view, it did return the index view, but it did it by default. So I'm going to specify, and that seems to make it easier for the testing to see what is actually happening. So I'm going to specify the actual name, because if I look down here at the result, oops, you can see that here under error message on the one that failed, this is the one that failed, it says that it expected to see index as the return value and it got nothing as the return value. And that's because I was just using the default name of the view here. Now that I've got the specific one in here, I'm going to run all the tests again. And this time, 28 out of 28 passed. Now let's see what else we can test for. We tested to see that a dictionary got the correct information onto the page. That was the default here in the home controller test, so we know how to do that. We know how to check to see if the correct index is what's returned. Let's change it to see what data is being returned. Now to do that, I need to call the controller details method instead of the index method. And I need to send it some sort of data to display, because when you call a details method, you're asking it to display some kind of some sort of data that's being provided to it. Remember that the purpose of a view, like the details view, is to take whatever data is provided to it and display it. Okay, so in this case, I expect what's in the model. I'm saying that I expect what's in the model to be the number that I call the details method with. So here under my assertion, I'm going to say the result of the view data model I'm going to assign it to ID, and then I'm going to check to see that the ID is in fact 42. Oh, and you can see here that, of course, the model is just an object, so I'm going to cast it to an integer to make sure that that will work. So we're calling the details method, assigning the return to result, then checking the model that is in that result and seeing if it is in fact 42. But I now have to change the controller also, because right now details, although it takes an integer ID, that view has to be set so we don't have one of those empty problems again. So I'm going to have to say details, and then this is the object that I'm sending along with it, which is, I'm sorry, not 42, but the ID. In other words, whatever's passed into it, whatever's passed into it is going to be sent along as the object to be displayed. The view details renders whatever ID is passed to it. Okay, I'm going to run everything again now. Whoops, I accidentally got that out there. I'm going to run it again up here and run all tests. And it looks like they all passed again. Okay, now I want to do something a little fancier. I'm going to go over to my item controller, and I'm going to create a sort of an error condition. I'm going to say that if the ID that's passed in is greater than 40, instead of showing those details, we're going to redirect back to the index, because I want to test the ability to redirect. So back here in test, I'm going to change the way this behaves. Actually, instead of doing that, right now, up until now, I've just been changing this method each time, but what you would really do is create new tests each time. So this time I'm going to go ahead and create a new test, and I'll call it, well, test redirect, because that's what it's doing. In other words, we want to keep building up a whole suite of tests so that we can do some regression testing. In other words, after one test is passed, let's try the next test and see what happens. Actually, instead of making it greater than 40, I think I'll make it greater than 50. That way I know that my previous test, this one here, should still be working correctly. But on this test, I'm going to send it 55, and then the result I expect to get back in this test redirect is not a view result. It's a redirect to route result. So let me check that. And then I don't need to do this. Instead, what I want to do is see if, in fact, I have been redirected to index. And so that's result, route values. And from that dictionary, I'll pick the action value. So if the route became action, and if what was in that routing action was index, then it worked. Okay, now I'm ready to run all tests again. And this time you're going to see that instead of 28, it runs 29 tests, and they all passed. So we're regression testing. When we added that new test, it tested it, but also all the other tests, so that makes sure that our new functionality, that if over 50 condition, that it worked itself, and also that it didn't break any earlier functionality as proved by the tests. So you've seen how you can add testing for particular view, or for some particular data, or for the action result, and how to add new tests and run all your tests to perform continuous integration with regression testing. Well, I obviously only gave you a brief and simple introduction to MVC and Visual Studio. So here's some more resources that you can use to learn more about ASP.NET MVC2 in Visual Studio 2010 and .NET 4.0. This first URL is the home page for Visual Studio on MSDN. It has a link to the download site for Visual Studio 2010, which is now in Beta 2, and it's also got links to documentation and other help. And you can also get the training kit that has hands-on labs. Then the ASP.NET website has a whole series of video and print tutorials on MVC. The starting point is this second URL here. And MSDN has links to documentation and to other materials, including a good walkthrough for creating a basic ASP.NET MVC project with testing. The source code for my demos from this video and others are also on my blog at the URL that's shown up here, and I'm announcing on Twitter as new videos and new demos are posted. So if you'd like to know what's available and when, follow me on Twitter at nstrickland1. And now I'm finished for this session. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.